Hello, welcome to A Web of Stories. My name is Melinda. I apparently have a frog in my throat. And it's Monday. And during the month of March, which is March on the Moors, my Bronte reading event, I'm doing Monday on the Moors, which is where I kind of go through the Bronte content I have. It just seemed an easy way of doing it and staying on top of it. So today I have a standalone book review, and that is of Alice Hoffman's Here on Earth. But Alice Hoffman's not a Bronte. But this is a Bronte retelling. Here on Earth is a Wuthering Heights retelling. And I'm just going to say it right here. It's going to be really hard for me to talk about this book without spoiling Wuthering Heights. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give some sort of general remarks, and then I will tell you when I'm going to be kind of in the spoiler zone. And if you don't want the Wuthering Heights spoilers, you can turn off just then, okay? So anyway, this book came out in 1997. Let me double check that. 1997. And if you can tell, this was one of the early entries into the Oprah's book club. So there's that. And this is, well, let me just read the back of it for you. It's not going to spoil anything for either book. So just getting to a point. The best-selling author of Practical Magic and Turtle Moon, although I think this came out before Practical Magic, but whatever. And Turtle Moon now tells her most seductive and mesmerizing story. After 19 years in California, March Murray, I'll say a little point about that. March Murray returns to the small Massachusetts town where she grew up. For all this time, March has been avoiding her own troubled history, but when she encounters Hollis, the boy she loved so desperately, the man who has never forgotten her, the past collides with the present as their reckless love is reignited. This dark romantic tale asks whether it is possible to survive a love that consumes you. The answers that March Murray discovers are both heartbreaking and wise, as complex as they are devastating. For in heaven and in our dreams, love is simple and glorious, but it is something altogether different here on Earth. So that's the back synopsis. First note, I did not like the name March. It didn't work for me. Plus, there's a place in this book called the Marshes, which that just was really confusing. Just that's a me thing. So I'm going to start out saying I gave this 3 stars. And 3 stars in my rating system can be one of 2 things. One is it's a book that I would recommend with caveats, or I'd only recommend to a certain group of people or whatever. It can also be a book I don't know what I think of. And this kind of falls under both of those categories. This is definitely a tougher book. There are trigger warnings for this book. So if you choose to pick this up, and who should read it in just a second, be sure to check out trigger warnings because there are some. Now, normally when I say I'm only recommend, I'd recommend it to these people, sort of roughly, but I'm going to be pretty strict on this one. This book is only for people who have read and liked Wuthering Heights. If you have not read Wuthering Heights, this will be a very confusing book. If you read and didn't like Wuthering Heights, you need to not even be in the same building as this book, okay? You just need to not touch it. It needs to be far away. This book will hurt you, okay? If you did not like Wuthering Heights. So, as for the need to have read Wuthering Heights, I buddy read this with Michelle at Michelle and Reads, and Michelle had tried in the past to read Wuthering Heights and DNF'd it, so she wasn't very familiar with the story. And right at the beginning, she was saying she was confused because there were so many characters, and I can definitely see that. However, I know the story of Wuthering Heights. Oh, t-shirt check. All my Bronte novels. I'm very familiar with the story of Wuthering Heights, so I immediately knew who everybody was in this book, which is fine. It made it a very easy reading experience in that sense. Writing style, Alice Hoffman is a very talented writer. That being said, this is definitely on the earlier side of her career. There were some things in it that bothered me about her writing style, but I don't see in later books. So I kind of see that as she was still honing her craft. And I think writers, no matter how good they are, they hone their craft as they go along, right? One thing is this is generally a beautifully written book. But there are parts where it kind of goes into the cheesy, and both Michelle and I were trying to figure out what it was with that, right? And what I think it is that Alice Hoffman has an affinity for the whimsy, which is great. I mean, if you've read the Practical Magic books, you know what I'm talking about in some of her other books. This story is not whimsy friendly. And I think she knew that, but the whimsy still wanted to come out. And at the point where she couldn't control it is when it went into cheese, if that makes sense. So there is that. But yes, trigger warnings, some writing issues, but not horrible. And definitely, if you read this and those writing issues bother you, do not write off Alice Hoffman, because she does get better in those areas. One thing I thought was really good. So as I said, this book was published in 1997, but I can tell you this book does not take place in 1997. Just from like details that are in this book, nothing pointed, just sort of random little details as to like what someone's wearing or how they do this. I can tell you this book was set in the 80s, probably 1984. So there you go. It has a good sense of time and a beautiful sense of place. That's probably one of the best things about this book, is the sense of place. So that's what I would say going into it. Now, from here on out, I will most likely be spoiling Wuthering Heights. If you have read Wuthering Heights, feel free to stay, or if you don't really care, feel free to stay. But if you are planning to read Wuthering Heights and you don't want to be spoiled, this is your point to check out, okay? I'll just put, you're now being spoiled, okay? I'm gonna put a little sign up. Okay, so I'm going to get into the details of this book. Now, this is a pretty close retelling of Wuthering Heights. So while if you already know the story of Wuthering Heights, you kind of already know the story of this book, okay? So it'd be a little hard to spoil this book, although I will try to stay away from anything more than the mildest spoilers. So we have March and her daughter, Gwen. So clearly March is the Kathy character. Gwen is actually, March would be Catherine. No, Kathy. The mother and the daughter. I always forget in Wuthering Heights which one's which. Hollis is clearly Heathcliff. There is the Nellie Dean character is interesting because she's not actually in this book. The instigating incident of this book is the housekeeper who sort of raised these kids, Judith Dale, has died. So that's the Nellie Dean character. So her presence is sort of in the book, but she is not in the book, and she's definitely not a narrator. Hank would be Hareton. I think that's Hareton. So if you've read Wuthering Heights, you very quickly, you know who everybody is in this. There are some additional characters, most notably a character named Susanna Justice, or Susie Justice, who is March's friend. And I will tell you, she is one of the cool characters. Wuthering Heights is a book, if you've gotten this far, you know, it's a book about terrible people doing terrible things to each other, and that is here. But I will say there are some better characters in this book. Like, there are some characters you root for in this book where there really aren't in Wuthering Heights. I mean, Gwen, the daughter, is a great character. Susie Justice, great character. There's this like handyman guy who's not really that big of a character, but he's important, and yeah, you root for him. So there are those breakpoints. You also have some sort of extra stories going on. You have the story of Susie Justice's parents, which kind of delves in with Judith Dale, which is sort of an issue. You have Hank and his father, who is March's brother, the way it is in Wuthering Heights. There is a story developed there. So you have these other little stories. And this is not a long book, 293 pages in this edition. So I know people who have read Wuthering Heights and are kind of shell-shocked after reading it, right? I don't have that issue with Wuthering Heights. I love Wuthering Heights, okay? I do. But I also know it's terrible people doing terrible things to each other. And probably because it's set in the 19th century, there is this wall of time between myself and the actions of this book. I'm able to kind of look at that from the outside. And I am not bothered, especially, by terrible people doing terrible things in Wuthering Heights. Now, this book, as I said, is set in what I think is 1984, which Bookish Best Friend reminded me just yesterday, that would make it historical fiction. This is not historical fiction because it's about the time that she wrote it. So if anything, it's a time capsule, but whatever. I didn't have that wall of time because I lived through 1984. I was shell-shocked. This book shooketh me. I was, wow. So I'm going to start out by saying Hollis, like Heathcliff is a terrible character. Like terrible, not terribly creative, but he's just a terrible person, right? He is a complete angel next to Hollis. Hollis is so horrible. So horrible. And that was really hard to take. And he's horrible in ways that aren't foreign to modern day. I guess that's the way to put it. So again, there isn't that wall where, as with Heathcliff, there is, because there is that distance. There's also some things in Wuthering Heights that don't translate well to putting it into a more modern time period. For example, in the 19th century, especially when you lived in a small community, getting it on with your cousin was pretty normal. Marrying your cousin. Let me just say marrying your cousin. However, if you go into like the 1980s and you date your cousin, that's weird. And that happens here. Yeah, that's there. And so the whole time, whereas in Wuthering Heights, when that thing happens, I'm like, okay, that's okay. I didn't even think anything about it because that's something that would have been normal then. When it happens here, and they make a point of saying they know their first cousins, I'm like, that's incest. That is weird. So there is all that. There is, as far as trigger warnings, and I do want to put this out here. It comes very close. It comes very close to animal cruelty in parts of this book. It comes close enough that if animal cruelty is an issue for you, this book will bother you. I won't go into it further than that because it would be a little bit of a spoiler for the book. So we have this book. I'm going to go into it. You know the story is. So March comes back and her draw to Heathcliff. So just like in Wuthering Heights, she has ended up marrying the brother of the person that Hollis, the Heathcliff character, marries, whose name is Belinda. Richard and Belinda in this one. And Belinda has passed, which is actually important to the story. Richard is off in California because he's like a bug professor. He's into bugs, which has nothing to do with anything. But she comes back to town because Judith Dale has died and she's there for the funeral and to kind of clear out the house, which she finds at that point that that Judith Dale did not own at that point, or because it had been her family home. And then when Judith Dale passed, the expectation would go to her or her brother, Alan, who's also known as the coward in this book. But then you find out that no, Hollis has bought. He let Judith Dale live there, but Hollis still owns it, but he's going to let you stay there. And that sort of, that happened in Wuthering Heights where Heathcliff took over Wuthering Heights. But here, Hollis has become like a real estate person. And he got there by very kind of shifty means. And immediately there's this weird draw between March and Hollis. And I will say it is weird. I will say it is much more organic between Kathy and Heathcliff than it is between Hollis and March. Like, it just is. And to the point where March just doesn't feel like she can resist him. But there's also other things going on. Like, Hollis is doing his best to make this happen. Hollis, however, hates her daughter Gwen. At one point early in the book, they're talking about March had been in communication with Hollis when she was pregnant with Gwen. And at one point he says to her, that baby, with whom she's pregnant with this child, that's more important to you than me. And I'm like, yeah, of course it's more important than you. So that's kind of the level we're dealing with. And of course, Gwen kind of gets the hots for Hank, who is her cousin. And things go on from there. And it is really dark, really, really dark and very, very disturbing. As I said, I was shell-shocked when this book finished. I will say also, for everything that happens in Wuthering Heights, again, I love Wuthering Heights. For everything that happens in Wuthering Heights, I do think ultimately the ending of Wuthering Heights is incredibly successful. I think that it is satisfying. It's like all this stuff happened and it ended the way it should, and you feel that you got from the ending what you needed to have closure from that story, right? I've been saying right a lot. That is not the case here. And both Michelle and I were like, this ending was really dissatisfying. And I won't say what happened. You can read it. I would be interested if anyone who read Wuthering Heights reads this, what they think of the ending. Because my other problem is she brings in these other storylines like Hank and his father and the Justice's parents and things going, or Susanna Justice's parents, all these other little storylines that are not developed as well as I would have liked them to be. Definitely not as developed as the main one is, but she makes such a point of them in the story. I felt like they should have been developed more. And the way the book ends, I'm like, if this book was about a different storyline, it would have been a great ending, but that's not what this book was about. And you ended it in the way, like, it's like you took the ending from one story and put it onto this one, which was kind of weird. So yeah, this book, Michelle and I were just like, oh my God. For a lot of those, like, oh boy. You do root for characters. You root for Gwen. You root for Susie. There are times when you want to kill March. Like, I wanted to reach through and just wring her neck. You pretty much always want to kill Hollis because he's horrible. But yes, so as I said at the beginning of this video, if you read and liked Wuthering Heights, you are the only group of people who should be reading this book. Now, that's not to say I think you're going to like the book. You may like the book. I'm not saying you won't like the book. I'm saying that you might not like the book. You might have the same reaction I did to it. Or you might think it's a really good retelling. I mean, in a lot of ways, I think this is a good retelling. The Brontes are hard to retell. They're hard to adapt. They just are. I mean, I think the big comparison, of course, is always Jane Austen. I think Jane Austen is pretty easy to adapt as far as movies. There's so many different movies of all of Jane Austen's books, right? And there's retellings of them. And I just think her stories are sort of timeless in that way. And they're sort of, I think they adapt well. That's not a jab against them. They just do. That's just what it is. But I don't think Bronte novels generally do. And I think of all of them, Wuthering Heights is the hardest one to adapt. So props to Alice Hoffman. I think she did the best she possibly could with this. There were I think this would be a better book if she wrote it later in her career, just from some of the writing things I was talking about. But that's neither here nor there. So I definitely give her props for that. And I think you can tell reading this, she understood Wuthering Heights. Like, sometimes you read retellings of other works and you're like, they didn't get this, did they? Like, they didn't understand the original material, or they didn't like what the original material was, so they were trying to mold it to what they thought it should be. You see that sometimes. That's not the case here. Alice Hoffman knows Wuthering Heights. She understands it. That's probably why I like her writing, because I like Wuthering Heights. So props to all her. But I will say this is a book, and maybe it's a good thing that I was so affected by it, because, as I said, I was not even that affected by Wuthering Heights in the same way, because there's that distance, whereas that distance isn't here. And it's like, oh my God, like I felt physically ill in points because I was so bound up in it. So yeah, that's what I would say. If you have read this book, or if you love Wuthering Heights and you decide to read this book, I would love to know what you think of it, because right now I've not looked at reviews. I've looked at sort of the breakdown of ratings, but I haven't looked at reviews of it. So other than myself and Michelle, I'm kind of in the dark what other people think of this book. So if you fall into one of those groups and you read this book, please let me know, because I'm very interested. And I am glad that I read this. As I said, I've been trying to read Alice Hoffman's extensive backlist. And so this knocks another one off there. And I would always have been curious about it. And I don't think there could be a better Wuthering Heights retelling. I just think Wuthering Heights is a hard story to retell or to adapt or to do any of that. I think she did the best she could. And that's probably better than most could do. So there you go. Those are my thoughts on Alice Hoffman's Here on Earth. It is dedicated to E.B., who I'm assuming is Emily Bronte. So to E.B. So yeah, this is, if you've read it, this is a book for people who have read and loved Wuthering Heights, and you might like this one. There you go. That's all I have to say for this one. Next week, I'm not quite sure what I'll have up next week. I might have another kind of retelling review I might have that. And I might have a movie review. I'll probably do a video of every Bronte thing I've done this week and just kind of wrap that up. So that would be what will that be? That will be the 24th. And then the 31st, I'm going to do a wrap up of the whole month. So that's what's coming up. And I'd love to hear how March of the Moors is going for you. We are still doing our read along of Agnes Grey. And if you haven't been reading along Agnes Grey and you want to jump in now, that's perfectly fine. There's discussion up on the Discord, the Bronte Discord, not my normal Discord. And I'll put a link to that below. And also there's a Voxer group I can add you to. You're welcome to join in on that. If you've been reading other Bronte novels, there's places to discuss that on the Discord, and I'd also love to hear what you think of them. So anyway, yeah, I'm starting to babble. So we're going to say like, subscribe, join my Discord, either one of them. And I'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye.